Great. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with us, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So for those unfamiliar, could you first say your name and kind of what you do?
Okay. James Gelvin, and I'm a professor of modern Middle East history at UCLA.
And what can you tell us about what's going on?
What's going on is that Israel has been attacked by an organization called Hamas. Hamas is in charge of the Gaza Strip, which is in the south of Israel, on the coast. And it's a militant Islamist organization they claim to be fighting for Palestinian rights.
Mm-hmm. And what can you tell us about the history of Hamas? Like, for those who don't know, what is Hamas?
Hamas is, as I said, an Islamist organization. It was founded in 1987 during the first uprising against Israeli occupation. It won elections actually in 2006 and then took over the Gaza Strip in 2007. And the relationship between Hamas and Israel has been very, very fraught. There have been confrontations back and forth over time. But it's not only Israel that Hamas has a problem with. Running the West Bank is another Palestinian group called the Palestinian Authority. And Hamas and the Palestinian Authority don't get along very well. And I always like to tell my students that it's like a married couple that's getting a divorce. Half the time they talk about reconciliation, half the time they want to kill each other.
Mm-hmm. I looked on a map and it looks like the West Bank is a vastly larger amount of space than Gaza.
It's a vastly large amount of space. It's also got about double the population as Gaza. The thing about Gaza, which your audience should know, is that Gaza is a extraordinarily crowded, one of the most crowded places on earth, extraordinarily poor society in which about half the population is under the age of 18. So any Israeli incursion into Gaza is going to be killing a lot of children.
And Israel has had a history of doing that?
Israel has had a history of doing it, but what has happened in the past is probably going to be done in spades now.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the goal that Israel has now is to destroy Hamas. And they also, of course, are trying to free the hostages that Hamas took last week. The problem is, of course, that this is a highly urbanized society, a highly concentrated society. So it's going to be very, very tough for Israel to do that. And it's going to be impossible for them to do that without civilian casualties. So in the past, what Israel has done has been what they call mowing the grass, which is that they get a missile attack from the Gaza Strip. They try to take out the missiles. They try to make it so that the Hamas is relatively disarmed, destroying whatever stockpiles of weapons they have. And at the present time, basically their goal is very, very different. Their goal is to destroy Hamas.
What does Hamas believe on a core level?
On a core level, it believes that Palestine is a gift of God, and that surrendering any part of Palestine is sort of like wrong and against God's wishes. And it has imposed Islamic law in the Gaza Strip. Gaza is a little bit more conservative than the West Bank, and so has been under this control for, as I said, 15 years or so.
Mm-hmm. When you say conservative, what does that look like in terms of a highly urbanized Islamic city?
Well, it looks like many other Islamic cities. I mean, basically, women have to be covered, for example. There's segregation of the sexes, things like that. Islamic law is theoretically enforced, although Islamic law is basically in the eyes of the beholder. So, Hamas is an organization that is very, very similar to the Muslim Brotherhood that at one point ran Egypt after the protests of 2011.
So when you say they believe that Palestine is a gift from God, can you expand on that a little bit more?
Well, there are a lot of Israelis who believe that Palestine is a gift of God to them as well, that they have a covenant with God to inhabit the entirety of Palestine. Now, the phrase that Hamas uses is it's a waqf. It's a religious endowment. and that they really can't surrender any part of that religious endowment. Now, in the beginning, basically, Hamas's charter said that all of Palestine should be an Islamic state. In 2017, they changed the charter to say that the West Bank and Gaza should be part of an Islamic state, and Jerusalem should be the capital. Now, what Hamas really believes, what they're capable of doing is, I assume, they know full well that terrorist attacks are not going to have Israelis pack up their bags and leave for someplace else. I assume that they realize that the best they could effect is the rule of some sort of rule over the West Bank and of Gaza, but they have maximalist demands right now.
So where does a lot of the rage toward the Israelis come from?
Well, the rage goes all the way back. I mean, basically what we have is we have two nationalist movements that are vying for control over a piece of territory. And this has happened since the end of the 19th century or so. And you've had a series of wars. 1948 was the most important for our benefit. That was when the State of Israel was declared, Arab armies invaded, and about 720,000 Palestinians were forced to flee. In the wake of that, basically the Palestinians called 1948, the Israelis call it the War of Independence, Palestinians call it the Nakba, the disaster. And ever since then, the issue of Palestine has been on and off the international agenda. Now, whenever Palestine is no longer on the front burner of international affairs, the Palestinian national movement, either the secular one or the Islamist one, tries to put it back onto the international agenda. And what we see actions, operations, like what we saw over the weekend when that happens. And certainly what's happening now is that Palestine is no longer, or has before this, was no longer on the international agenda. That instead, Palestine had pretty much dropped off. We see a whole bunch of Arab countries normalizing relations with Israel. Rumor has it that Saudi Arabia is also attempting to normalize relations. So basically what that means for groups like Hamas is that the Palestine issue is dropping off the radar screen of the international community. They want to put it back there.
So you think that the main purpose of some of these terror attacks is to put themselves optically back in the forefront of the news cycle?
Yes, I mean, there's two reasons historically why these operations have occurred. One of them is basically to keep the Palestine question alive. And the other one is to make sure that there's no compromise that takes place of Palestinian aspirations. So, for example, the normalization of relations, and particularly if this normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, would certainly be a blow to the Palestinian national movement. And the Palestinians are afraid that the Saudis and others will pay lip service merely to the Palestinian national cause and allow, for example, the expansion of Israeli settlements on the West Bank, will allow, for example, the Israeli control over Jerusalem, will prevent the right of return of Palestinians to Israel, and so therefore they have resisted it.
So what is the Palestine question?
The Palestine question is fundamentally who is going to control all or some of this territory and how we're going to figure this thing out.
What about this territory is so special to both groups?
Well, for Jews, it was a place that has been remembered in Jewish prayer and Jewish history. The Jews actually had a kingdom there under David and Solomon, and were there until the Romans threw them out in the 1st century BC. And for the Palestinians, they were there when the Jews began to arrive with the Zionist movement. And Jewish immigration was something that, at first was an annoyance and then became a real problem. And during the period between World War I and World War II, things boiled over. And that's when we see the conflict really beginning the way it is now. You have a mass nationalist movement beginning in Palestine. You have in Israel, the Zionist movement arming itself and expanding its settlements throughout the area that is current-day Israel.
So what is Zionism?
Zionism is Jewish nationalism. What the Zionists did was they took a religious community and they made it into a national community. Basically, this religious community had a affinity for Palestine, had been in Palestine in ancient times. And so the idea was the restoration of the community back to its ancestral land. This is not the only nationalist movement that's done something like that. It's just one of many that's done something like that. The Palestinians, in resisting the Zionist aspirations, also developed their own mass nationalism. And so therefore what we see is two groups that are vying for control over a single small area, actually, about the size of New Jersey.
Mm-hmm. Wow, it's that small.
That's the size of current day Israel. And you add onto that the West Bank, you're not adding on a hell of a lot.
And so comparatively, using New Jersey as an example, would Gaza be like Trenton or Newark, or how big would it be?
Gaza, it consists of whatever the equivalent would be. It's about 2 million people. It's about 25 miles long. It's on the coast. It's one of the most densely inhabited areas on Earth. And it's an impoverished population for the most part, impoverished for a variety of reasons. Most of the population are refugees coming in from 1948 and 1967.
Is there nightlife there and stuff?
We have an Islamist government. So basically, is there a nightlife in Tehran? I'm sure if you look for it, you'll find it. But, it's not all that public.
So comparatively, like next to something like Tel Aviv, it's a whole different ballgame.
It's a whole different ballgame, but the level of poverty is far greater than Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is one of the most expensive cities to live in. It's like Los Angeles or New York or a city like that. Gaza is impoverished and has been under economic sanction from Israel. It borders on both Israel and Egypt, and then the Mediterranean coast. And neither Egypt nor Israel have friendly relations with the Hamas government there. Egypt, of course, is a military dictatorship now, very much opposed to Muslim Brotherhood type movements, which Hamas is one. And Israel, of course, and Hamas have not gotten along since the beginning.
What percentage of people in Gaza do you think support Hamas?
That's impossible to say. And the reason it's impossible to say is they don't do public opinion polls in these autocratic governments. So what part of the population, number of the population supports the Saudi regime, for example, or any of these autocratic regimes in the Middle East?
They would just tell you 100%.
Yeah. They're smart, they know.
Yeah. So back to Zionism, where did it start? It started in Europe, right?
Zionism started in Europe. It actually was strongest in Eastern Europe. Basically, the Russian Empire tried to integrate Jews into the Russian Empire by slowly having them convert, by slowly getting them to work, be conscripted into the military and so on and so forth, to make Russians out of them.
So, is there a connection between like World War II, the experience of the Jews there?
Well, it was interesting. Barack Obama went to Israel once and said, basically Jews deserve Israel because of what they experienced during the Holocaust. And he was corrected by the Prime Minister of Israel, who said Jews deserve Israel because we have our ancient habitation there. Okay. Now, the Zionist movement began before the Holocaust. The Jewish immigration to Palestine began before the Holocaust and continued after the Holocaust as well. So therefore, to trace it to the Holocaust is probably just a narrative option that you have.
Yeah, it's a common trope that I've heard, growing up.
Yeah. But, fundamentally, if there was a relationship between the Holocaust and a Jewish homeland, why not make the Jewish homeland in Bavaria, for example?
Yeah, that's what I always wondered. I was like, why would you go to a place where it's surrounded by people who don't like you?
Right.
So during the initial during the initial Zionist migration, or during the initial Jewish migration into what's now Palestine, was Palestine ever a country?
Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire until 1922, actually. And the British got what's called a mandate for Palestine. In other words, they were supposed to supervise Palestine during the interwar period. The problem is that it was pretty much impossible to keep the two sides separate during the period, and so the British just threw up their hands at a certain point and said, "Okay, we're done." When they did that, they withdrew from Palestine. The Jews declared statehood. The Arab armies invaded. There was a brief civil war between Palestinians and Jews, which basically led to the Nakba, to the emigration.
So timeline-wise, so Israel declares statehood in 1948.
Israel declared statehood in 1948. This is after a brief civil war with the Palestinians.
Our full 60-minute interview is available exclusively on our Patreon, www.patreon.com/channel5. Love you guys. Bye.